4th of July, 1777. The United States of America declares its independence from the United Kingdom. 9th of April, 1865. The Confederates surrendered to the Union, ending the American Civil War. 14th of August, 1945. Emperor Hirohito signed his surrender to the United States. Well, these are some of the historic dates that marked real turning points for Americans, and now we have to add a new one. 2nd of April, 2025. The President's christening of Trade Liberation and Industrial Emancipation Day for the United States of America.
April 2nd, 2025 will forever be remembered as the day American industry was reborn, the day America's destiny was reclaimed, and the day that we began to make America wealthy again. We're going to make it wealthy, good and wealthy. This is one of the most important days, in my opinion, in American history. It's our declaration of economic independence.
Donald Trump has ended up slamming the door on the international economic model with a massive imposition of tariffs worldwide. The president's hands were not enough to show all the new tariffs on imports that will take effect in the next few days. And VisualPolitik community, it seems that in this matter, everyone got their own slap in the face.
China, on top of all current tariffs, will now have an extra 34% tariff, bringing the total to over 50%. The EU, on the other hand, takes 20%, but even countries allied with Trump such as Israel, Japan, and India have also taken a good slap in the face. More than 180 territories now have a new trade barrier with the United States.
While the Oval Office has celebrated this policy as Economic Liberation Day, many experts have preferred to use another description. Donald Trump has officially initiated the deglobalization of the US economy, something that the markets have clearly looked at as a worst-case scenario.
As soon as Trump began speaking on the White House lawn, it didn't take long for stock futures to start falling sharply. Most analysts have been warning for weeks about the massive increase in the cost of the shopping basket, the possible rise in inflation, the loss of competitiveness, the loss of jobs, and many are already clear that we are heading towards a recession. But none of this has any place in the Trumpist ideology, which has just made an all-or-nothing bet on its economic model.
But now it's our turn to prosper, and in so doing use trillions and trillions of dollars to reduce our taxes and pay down our national debt, and it'll all happen very quickly.
And it's precisely at this point that we can ask several questions. How big are the tariffs that Trump has imposed really? Who are the most affected? Which countries managed to escape or at least come out easier from Liberation Day? What's next for the US after this trade shutdown? Can the Trump board change the world's trade flow? Well, we're going to be looking at all this and more. So, let's get started. Washington defeated the British Crown, Lincoln defeated the Confederates, and Truman struck the final blow for the surrender of Tokyo. The question now, as Trump is celebrating America's economic independence, is who the hell are they getting rid of? Well, that would be the foreign scavengers who, according to him, have been plundering Uncle Sam for years.
Foreign leaders have stolen our jobs, foreign cheaters have ransacked our factories, and foreign scavengers have torn apart our once beautiful American dream.
With an ultra-patriotic narrative, the president has announced 184 tariffs, of which 59 exceed the 10% base. And all, according to the president, supposedly to counteract the mistreatment the United States has received from its trading partners. And here some people might say, well, since the idea was to be reciprocal, that is to treat others the way the United States is being treated, Trump must have imposed the same tariffs they're charging us. Right? Well, no. What the White House has done is to invent, where it suits it, mind you, a metric in which it equates to a tariff the weight of the US trade deficit on total US sales to Uncle Sam. Thus, if a country sells to the United States a total of, say, $1 billion, and only buys $800 million, then the White House says they are imposing a 20% tariff. It doesn't make any sense. It's completely absurd, and it's economic nonsense to talk in these terms. But it doesn't matter, because that's exactly what they've done to try to convince the American people that they're really being mistreated by the rest of the world. Of course, then Trump added a whole lot of embellishments.
And in many cases, the non-monetary barriers were worse than the monetary ones. They manipulated their currencies, subsidized their exports, stole our intellectual property, imposed exorbitant VAT taxes.
But whatever, the calculation they actually made was botched.
They talk about reciprocal tariffs, but in reality, the calculation is a joke.
In other words, no matter how much they may have embellished the real data, they didn't give a damn. They have simply been looking for an excuse to launch this crazy trade war. And yes, there are some points in which they are right, like, for instance, that China doesn't play fair, but most of the accusations need to be taken with more than a grain of salt.
Beijing artificially keeps its currency undervalued against the dollar so that Chinese products are cheaper in the US. It's an unfair practice, and the complaint is legitimate, even if it's very difficult to estimate the real value. But in other cases, for example, the complaint that Trump is constantly repeating about the European VAT makes no sense. In the European Union, this tax is charged to the final consumer and is paid on all products, whether imported or locally produced.
Whatever the case, these are all just excuses. Trump and his team are obsessed with tariffs, with devaluing the dollar, and with producing at home. They are big fans of the import substitution policy that Latin America has been working on for decades. VisualPolitik community, the Republican tycoon has dealt a real blow to several countries. Check it out.
Among the most affected, we can find a lot of Asian countries. Cambodia and Vietnam stand out, but there's also Taiwan, South Korea, Japan, and India, who now feel that the Americans have stabbed them in the back.
Do you know, by the way, what this means beyond the economic issue? That Washington can say goodbye to much of its influence in this region of the world. All the effort of years and years down the drain. But Trump doesn't care. He keeps repeating figures that are a complete pack of lies.
You know, you think of the European Union, very friendly. They rip us off. It's so sad to see. It's so pathetic. 39%, we're going to charge them 20%, so we're charging them essentially half. Japan, 46%. They would charge us 46%, and much higher for certain items like cars, you know, little items like cars. India, very, very tough, very, very tough. The Prime Minister just left. He's a great friend of mine, but I said, you're a friend of mine, but you're not treating us right. They charge us 52%.
And mind you, the damage is more than considerable. Take a look at this graph. What you are looking at is the average US tariff over the last few decades. The green dot is the result of applying what was announced on Liberation Day. As you can see, we are well above the levels of even the tariffs that made the 1929 crisis so long.
If the US model of recent decades has consisted of clearly betting on globalization, selling and buying as freely as possible, and having its companies control markets all over the world, Trump now wants to change this model.
The problem is that this has been a tremendously successful model. America has become richer, has led in all new technologies, and has created more jobs and more prosperity than ever before. But now two possible paths are open.
On the one hand, there are those who say that this is a negotiating strategy, that now the rest of the countries will kneel down to make all kinds of concessions to Washington in exchange for the White House reducing tariffs for them. According to the White House, if countries offer concessions, then Trump is more than willing to reduce these tariffs, not eliminate them, but reduce them.
But on the other hand, there are those who point out that these tariffs are actually a crucial part of the new economic architecture that Trumpism wants to implement, something we've also been talking about on VisualPolitik. In any case, in true thuggish style, Washington is issuing clear warnings to the rest of the world. Don't even think of responding, accept them, bow your heads, ask for forgiveness, and beg us to lower the percentage of tariffs by a couple of points, otherwise we're going to punish you.
Well, I think there have been a lot of discussions, but I think we're just going to have to wait and see what would happen. What I would say, Anne-Marie, is I would advise none of the countries to panic. I wouldn't try to retaliate, because as long as you don't retaliate, this is the high end of the number. And I think the market could have certainty that this is the number barring retaliation. So we've got a ceiling, and then we can see if there's a different floor.
The truth, it doesn't seem like the best way to strengthen ties. At this rate, Washington is going to get the rest of the world to agree to stand against them. But then again, that's Trumpism. But do you want to know the most surprising thing? Tariff policy does not fall within the discretionary powers of the president. He can only establish them in specific cases where a problem is detected. But a general tariff against the rest of the world, whatever the case, it doesn't seem that Congress is very willing to make a move. Be that as it may, it is clear that his constituency now most likely expects an unprecedented takeoff.
We support Donald Trump's policies on tariffs 100%. So, Mr. President, we can't thank you enough, And in 6 months or a year, we're going to begin to see the benefits. I can't wait to see what's happening 3 or 4 years down the road. Thank you, Mr. President.
You heard it. Within 6 months, we're going to start to see the benefits. And by the end of the term, unbelievable. Humans on Mars, and everything made in the United States. Although frankly, as many analysts and think tanks are warning, even those close to the Republican Party, what this could turn out to be is a huge Pandora's box. Right now, the likelihood of a recession, even on an international scale, has skyrocketed.
My answer is very simple. If they complain, if you want your tariff rate to be zero, then you build your product right here in America, because there is no tariff if you build your plant, your product in America.
But is this good for the United States? Well, no. Families and businesses will have to pay much more for their purchases. The profits of many companies will fall, and investment in local production will probably not be as large as some expect. Why? Well, for 2 reasons. First, because companies know that, in less than 2 years, in the midterm elections, everything could change. And second, Trump has no more than this term left. On the other hand, although the United States is a huge market, it's becoming less and less so in relative terms. In other words, even when factories are set up, they are usually built with local production in mind, and not with a view to being competitive with the rest of the world. In the long run, this will probably lead to more expensive production and worse products. This is what has always happened in Latin America with the import substitution policy. And that's not all. On top of that, there's no manpower in the United States for all these plans. Besides, how long would it take to build all these factories? And in the meantime, is everyone going to buy more expensive things just because? VisualPolitik community, the United States is not going to win with this whole story either. In the long run, it will most likely be the biggest loser, and that's not counting the political cost. For all these reasons, there are very, very few voices that believe that the US economy can have a renaissance this Liberation Day. Besides, what the hell? What revival? When Trump came to the White House, the US economy was cruising along. But now, companies like Nike, Apple, and Boeing, which were promising huge investments in the US, are facing a terrible chain of rising costs, which may end up causing a domino effect, but not only within the United States, but also beyond its borders. What do we mean by this? Well, it's possible many are beginning to be united by fear. Countries that we would never have imagined as allies could work side by side. Listen up.
Goodbye, America.
One thing that is striking is the distribution of these tariffs. Check it out.
Countries such as Venezuela and Iran, which according to the White House itself pose a huge threat to national security, only received tariffs of 15% and 10% respectively, barely half of the punishment announced against key allies such as Taiwan, Japan, or the EU.
Frankly, logic is conspicuous by its absence in this entire story, and logically, that is causing such surprising moves as this one.
China says it is aiming to coordinate tariff response with Japan, South Korea. The comments come after senior trade officials from the 3 Asian export hubs held their first economic dialogue in 5 years on Sunday as they gear up for more tariffs from the US this week.
That's right, on the 30th of March, the trade ministers of Japan, South Korea, and China met to exchange trade views. And while Beijing's message is probably somewhat exaggerated, one thing is certain: they are turning to each other for closer ties against the United States. That would have been unthinkable just a few months ago. The sense of betrayal by Washington is even causing them to consider a trade agreement to look for alternatives to the very same United States of America. Trump is attacking globalization hard, but the world will continue its march with or without the United States until the advent of Trumpism, Washington-led. That time may now be over. But anyway, at least all this leaves us with some good news for a region of the world that has not exactly fared well in recent years. I'm talking about Mercosur.
Mercosur countries have barely received a 10% punishment. This puts them in a better position with the industrial powers of Asia to be able to knock on the door of many multinationals and ask them to invest in Brazil, Argentina, Paraguay, or Uruguay with the aim of exporting to the United States. If these countries do their homework, this could be a great opportunity.
Let's just say that Mercosur could now be an attractive destination for Asian chains that need to produce in areas that are less punished by Washington. Be that as it may, now it's time to wait for the rest of the world to respond. Let's be clear about one thing. In the end, nobody wins with this whole story, no matter how much Trump keeps repeating things like this.
Hopefully you're going to look back in years to come and you're going to say, you know, he was right. This has turned out to be one of the most important days in the history of our country. God bless you and God bless America. Thank you, everybody.
But now it's your turn. What do you think about Trump's macro trade punishment? Is this the end of globalization? Or will the world simply learn to live without the USA? Leave us your opinions down in the comments. And if you found this video interesting, please give us a like and subscribe to VisualPolitik if you haven't already done so. All the best. I'll see you soon.